I'm going to start out with, I always like to start out with talking about where I come from. I'll share my screen to share some pictures. And then I just kind of want to just be in this room and space with people and not be in a PowerPoint. That's really important for me. So yeah, sort of navigating those two world approaches, right? Of the sort of colonized way of like presenting with a formal PowerPoint and indigenous ways of just being in a circle and sharing. So yeah. So just to share a little bit about where I come from, my mom and dad met in a small city in Connecticut. And this is the house that I grew up in. My dad was a really, really hard worker. He worked 2 full-time jobs when I was little so that he could provide for us. He grew up poor on a farm and wanted a different life for his kids. My mom and dad met when my mother was 13 years old and my dad was 18, and they were married when my mom was 15 years old. And she had my brother at 16 and she had me when she was 18 years old. And that's me, that chunky little baby. And my mom is Polish and Lithuanian, and my dad is Acadian French and has Mi'kmaq roots as well. When I grew up, we were outside all the time. So in the summer, we were at the beach. In the winter, we were outside playing in the snow, lots of snow, and always on snowmobiles or ice skating. And yeah, so being on the land was really always an important part of my world growing up, including when things weren't going well in my home. Like if my mom and dad got into an argument, there was a tree in my backyard that I would climb and hang out in there until it was quiet, and my mom would call me back into the house. Four-leggeds were always a big part of our world too. These are my current four-legged family members, and just always growing up with them being part of our family is really important. This is on my mother's side. So my great-grandmother, who immigrated here from Poland in 1901. I had the privilege of having her in my life until I was in my early 20s. And that was a wonderful gift of having a great grandma. And then my grandparents met in the military. My grandmother served during World War II, which was uncommon. These are pictures from my dad's side in Maine, and this is the farmhouse that he grew up in. And he had to quit school when he was in the 6th grade to help with the farm. It's a really big family. And my grandmother, my mame, is French Acadian, and my grandfather, my papa, is Acadian French, and his grandmother, we believe, was Mi'kmaq, and because of the territory that they were in, that's most likely where the indigenous roots lie. So I have a really big family. I grew up with 13 aunts and uncles and 22 first cousins. Even though I grew up in Connecticut, there was always a very strong connection to Maine. We spent a lot of time going there in the summer for weeks. We always would go there in the winter and freeze our butts off in the snow, like really. And so my dad was from, if you look at the top of the map, it was in Aroostook County, in the very northern part of the county along the St. John River, the border of Maine and Canada. So he grew up in the northest part of the eastern United States, literally across the river from Canada. And if you look at the map on the right, the New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia is where our ancestors migrated from, to the area in Maine. And those ancestors, again, Acadian French and Mi'kmaq, and that whole area is people of Mi'kmaq tribes. In Prince Edward Island alone, there are 13 Mi'kmaq reservations or reserves, they call them in Canada. And that's where I spend a lot of time every summer visiting with. It was really important for me to go back to where my ancestors are from and spend time with the people there. And so I spend a lot of time in the summer visiting with elders there, and my husband and I participate in a lot of different ceremonies when we go up there. Unfortunately, the last couple of years we haven't been able to do that because of COVID, but I'm really looking forward to getting up there again. So, I want to talk about why it was important for me to share all of that with you. And really, and so one of the things is talking about being Indigenous, who gets to claim that they are Indigenous. And that's a really important piece for me to just sort of reiterate, is that I am not enrolled in any tribe or any First Nation reserved in Canada or in the United States. I do have some tribes that I connect with, elders that I connect with and learn from and spend time with, but I am not a member of a tribe. My Indigenous roots, although they may be Mi'kmaq, I do not have any paperwork stating that as such. And I like to share that when I'm like really diving into who I am, because it's really important to acknowledge where I come from and where my lost identity is. So one of the things for me was growing up, hearing about my Indigenous lineage, and feeling strongly connected to that. But my family was very quiet about that. It was a secret. It was taboo that that anybody that wasn't Native was with somebody that was. It was, mixing races was not okay. And if there was a way to not have anybody in the household be seen as Native, if you could get away with that, you did, because during that time there was a lot of First Nations and Native children in the United States were being removed from their homes. They were being placed into what we call here Indian boarding schools, and what they call in Canada residential schools. And those boarding schools are not like, they are not designed like, rich people's boarding schools. They were designed to they couldn't kill the Indians anymore, so they decided to try to save them. And that's an actual famous quote from Captain Richard Pratt in the late 1880s. And so the goal was, well, we can't kill them off, so let's take their children and put them in boarding schools and assimilate them. We'll teach them how to speak English, punish them if they speak their native language, cut off all their hair, which is a significant for the boys, which was a significant part of many indigenous cultures, and strip them of their Indianness. And get them prepared to do domesticated work, to be farmers, for the women to be seamstresses, those types of things. So if your family could get away with not identifying as Native, you did that so that you could keep your children in the home. And that's that lost identity that a lot of Native people have. And then also there was a lot of Indian adoption that was going on too. So it's really important that, for me to talk about that and what that experience is like. When I was in my early 20s, in my very first going to community college, and in my very first human service class that I was taking, I was asked to do a genogram, a family tree. And that really sparked that interest for me in getting to know that part of my family tree, that lineage better. And so I was in my early 20s when I started attending different ceremonies and connecting with elders and traveling to up north to start learning more about my heritage. So that said, I've been in walking this path for more than half of my life. And is a significant part of who I am and the research that I do and my scholarly research as well. The other piece that I like to talk about is there's this thing in tribes where, there's over 550 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. And then there's state recognized tribes. And then there are tribes that are not recognized at all. And those tribes that are not recognized at all can't really claim themselves as indigenous on those little check boxes, right, that we have to fill out. I never check Native American because I'm not federally enrolled. So in all of my research that I do or anything that I do, it comes from that space of being a white Caucasian woman. Tribes have different degrees of blood quantum for citizenship. And each tribe has their different degrees of accepting somebody as Native within their tribe. Some tribes are really small and you need 1/8 of proof that you have that tribal blood in you. Some tribes ask for at least 25%. Some tribes will only accept children who are birthed, whose mother is from that tribe. And other tribes will only accept children whose father is from that tribe, which present a quandary for people who who are Native but are within a tribe that doesn't accept that, if their mom's native and that tribe only accepts the father's blood lineage, then that child isn't accepted as a member of that tribe. So there's a lot of sort of complex layers in all of this. And I've heard a lot of people who are a part of a tribe that don't agree with the blood quantum piece, because I've heard it referred to as sort of like the dog pedigree. You have to prove that your dog is 100% beagle, right? In order to get papers on them. So anyway, I think it's important to share that complexity that happens within Indian country. And Indian country, if you've not heard of that term, really refers to all of the reservations across the United States and Canada, and sort of that, all of those spaces making up Indian country. The other reason it's really important for me to share who I am and where I come from is really being mindful and paying attention to making sure that I'm being respectful, and not doing anything that would be considered cultural appropriation. And there's that also is a complex area as well. So with cultural appropriation, some people talk about if you take anything from somebody else's culture and use that as your own, then that's cultural appropriation. And that's sort of one end of the spectrum. And there's not a complete agreement on this either. And then the other end of the spectrum I've heard, which I really appreciate, I've heard some elders talk about how, if you like Native art, then by all means have Native art in your home. If you like to wear Native jewelry, then go ahead and wear Native jewelry. I mean, that's what we make it for, right? That's not cultural appropriation. It's not appropriating if you like a song and you're singing it, right? What's cultural appropriation to them is when you take something and use it to make monetary gain for yourself. So I've gone to sweat lodges in the past where, I remember a ceremony I went to a couple of years ago, and we had invited a neighbor who is not Indigenous, and she came and she participated in this sweat lodge ceremony with us. And as soon as we crawled out of that ceremony, she said, "Oh, I'm going to build one of these in my yard." And we were all like, no, you're not. You can't do that. You don't know what it's all about, right? You just participated in one ceremony. It's like going to church and leaving and saying you're going to be a pastor. You're going to build a church in your yard and be a pastor without going through the proper schooling to do that, right? Or you went to one therapy session and you leave and you're going to be a therapist, right? You can't do that. So that's definitely cultural appropriation. The other thing is, if you like Native art or Native jewelry, then you need to buy from Native people, not Walmart. That's like a Walmart cultural appropriating, right? So we don't want to support that. Yeah. And I'm open for questions. You can put them in the chat as I'm going through. If something, sparks a question for you, please feel free to do that. So I wanted to share a little bit about what it's like for me, and then I'll share about a couple specific teachings that I received early on that that really for women in Native culture. And I'll spend some time talking about that. So it's always interesting for me in being in this, particularly in this world of academia, which is very colonized. That's just the roots, right? And bureaucratic. So there's this sort of expected way of doing things, an expected way of being. And I'll share like one thing that came up for me in the last couple of years or last year that was challenging for me, was figuring out a way to submit my materials for promotion and tenure. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the process, you have to write this narrative of your teaching, your service, and your scholarship work. And typically those narratives are kind of like, I did this and I did that, and I'm on this and I'm involved with that. And even though I grew up in a blue collar household in that sort of colonized mindset, there were definitely Indigenous teachings that were passed down without even recognizing it, I think, from my dad. And also being really steeped in Indigenous culture and it being a part of my who I am today. It's really hard to write from that perspective. So because what I've learned growing up and in from my elders is humility. Really important to be humble, to not toot your horn. That people that say, I'm great and I did this and I did that are not good leaders, and we don't want them in leadership positions. Very different than the sort of colonized way, right, in academia. So that was really interesting for me to sort of figure out how to write this from a space that would feel good for me. And I did, and I fleshed that out with some other folks that I know that struggle with the same issues in other universities, and found a space to write it in a way that spoke to what tasks were done for the community rather than what I did. And so that was challenging. The other piece of that was having to make sure that in my cover letter for promotion and tenure, that I explained that my narrative was different. So I find that a lot of times I have to explain myself or explain the culture. And that can be exhausting sometimes. In one of the service pieces that I talked about in my materials and that I do is ceremony for people in need, and that includes Vision Quest ceremonies and Sweat Lodge ceremonies that my husband and I hold space for on the property that we are caregivers for. And so here's that different language, right? We take care of this property. We are caregivers for the land. In colonized language, it's the land we own. But in Indigenous culture, we don't own anything. So we take care of this land. According to the county, Madison County, we own it, but in our way of being, we take care of it. So in that service work, I also in my materials had to include some information about what a vision quest is and what a sweat lodge ceremony is, so that people on the committee would understand what I was talking about. So again, just really having to explain myself often, or explain, yeah, just explain myself often. Any questions so far? And you can just jump in or post in the chat. All right, so I want to kind of move to the space of talking about a couple of teachings that I had early on. And I just want to remind folks again that there are over 550 federally recognized tribes. They have different languages, different cultures. There are some threads of similarity that run through most tribes, but the way that things are done are different. So I'm just speaking from what I've been taught from my Mi'kmaq elders, and I also have some elders who are Lakota as well, and an elder who's Muskogee Creek, but that's a he. He's never taught me any of the women's traditions. So the first thing I want to share is one of the things I learned early on is about the importance of the skirt. And I have some different teachings about that, but there's this really great video on Facebook that I'm going to share with you that sort of kind of highlights that. So let me pull that up and share my screen.
Feel how your skirt touches the medicines. Feel how your skirt is in the middle of all of this greatness that we've been given. When you put your skirt on, you're showing Mother Earth who you are. The ribbons tell her your strength and what you carry, and the skirt itself comes from a very sacred place that we know of. In Cree, we call it the Mikiwap. In Dakota, they say Thibeault. And I guess in English today, they call it teepee. And that Mikiwap has a dress. It used to be made out of hide long ago. And when we think about that dress, we think about all the teachings that she carries, the first teacher, the woman. But the hide dresses that we used to wear, they used to have fringes on the bottom. And those fringes would touch the medicines as we walked the earth. And Mother Earth would always know who it was that was making their presence felt on her back, on her shoulders. So that when the prayer was made by that woman, Mother Earth would show her what it is that she needed. And you know, it's important for everybody to understand that we do not force women to wear their skirts. We do not shame them in any way. We have pride whenever a woman enters our circle, and it's our job as women to help her, if she so desires, to have skirts, extra skirts ready for her. But those of us who know the teaching and cherish the ways of the old people, we choose to honor ourselves as women by putting that skirt on. And we know that there's something for our children when they see us being proud of who we are as women. And I think that's the greatest teaching.
So I have been in communities that that do tell women you can't stay if you don't have a skirt on. And I really like, for me, I really appreciate this teaching because not everybody is comfortable with that. The other, and I wanted to go back and say, when the video first started, she talks about the medicines and what is the medicines. So in indigenous culture, medicines has a big meaning of your gifts, and it can be medicines from, with the skirt, it's really picking up the medicines from the earth, from the herbs that are in the grass, on the ground, from the energy from Mother Earth. And but medicines also means like those healing gifts that you carry. So for example, if you're really good at making people laugh, then humor, is a medicine for you, right? That's one of those things that you carry, that's a healing property, right? I like to sing indigenous songs, and that's a medicine that I carry and try to share, a gift that I try to share with people. The other thing that came to mind for me is in Native culture, a lot of women wear shawls with long fringe that goes to the ground, and that is also a way of sort of scooping up the energy from Mother Earth. Mother Earth is it, man. Mother Earth is, she provides everything that we need. If you think about everything in your life, it comes from Mother Earth, right? The trees come from Mother Earth. They provide us with oxygen so that we can breathe. We get our food from Mother Earth. We get our clothing from Mother Earth. So yeah, so really honoring that each and every day is really important. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is in Indigenous culture, for women, we talk about the moon time. And I'm only going to share a little bit about this. And again, different teachings from different tribes. So does anybody know what moon time means? So if you think about moon time, typically people think about the full moon and that the significance of the full moon. And yes, that's important. But in Indigenous culture, moon time means it's the time that a woman is in her menses, when we are bleeding. And that time is really sacred. It is so unusual to talk about that in colonized culture. Like ew, we don't talk about that. In Indigenous culture, we talk about it, we honor it. If you're in your moon time, everybody knows, because they're supposed to be honoring you. They're supposed to be taking care of you. This is a time when your body is working really hard. So there's a lot of tradition around that, around not cooking for your family and your family cooking for you. Wouldn't that be great? Having somebody else take care of your kiddos while you're in that sacred space. And my husband and I don't have a moon time anymore, but when I did, we always tried to practice those traditional ways as much as possible. It wasn't always possible because I have to work, but at least taking some time, as much time as I could, to honor that space and to be in that ceremony. And we call that, that's going into our own ceremony. That's a time for us as life givers to honor who we are, to slow down, to reflect, to be tired, and just be with ourselves. And I found that was a really hard, it was a really hard piece for me to navigate, these sort of two worlds, of like, don't tell anybody, like nobody should know if you're in your moon time, and it's embarrassing, right? To everybody knows, and enjoy that space of being honored. So I wanted to share a little bit about that too. So great question. So while moon time is honored, how is perimenopause and menopause thought of in Indigenous cultures? So when you go into that space, you are definitely considered crone or elder. You are a grandma. You are a wisdom keeper. You are looked to for knowledge. And in Indigenous culture, elders are highly, highly regarded. They are the most important. And in colonized culture, I think, particularly today, really our children, we think about our children being the most important. In Indigenous culture, our elders are the most important. I know for me, even though I'm in that menopause stage, I do still try to honor that full moon. I sort of go by the full moon cycle now, and at least have an afternoon or a day of getting quiet and honoring that time and allowing others to take care of me, which is also, really hard sometimes. That sort of colonized way is like, I got this, I don't need any help. It's all individual, right? And as women, we take care of everybody, kids, husband, partner, in our jobs. Most women are in jobs that are a caregiving role, some type of caregiving role. And so it just taking that space to not have to do that is really important, and used to be a challenge for me, and it's not so much anymore. It was interesting for me too, because when I went into that space of perimenopause and menopause, so oftentimes when someone is in their moon time, you can't attend. You're not allowed to attend different ceremonies that are going on, because the teaching is that you're in your own ceremony, and that women in their moon time are carrying a lot of spiritual energy. And if we show up at a ceremony, a different type of ceremony, then we're sort of taking that energy away from the ceremony that's happening for other people. And so they ask you to not attend different ceremonies when you're in your moon time. And of course, when I was in my moon time, there were so many things that happened, and I would, be getting ready to go to ceremony with my husband, and then I would start bleeding and I couldn't go. And I was like, so aggravated about some of that and those teachings, right? And then I would be like, I can't wait until I don't have to deal with this anymore. Then I can go to everything. And now that I can go to everything, it's like, I really want an excuse to like I really want to stay home. And I don't need to make an excuse. I can just say no. In colonized thinking, but indigenized thinking, no, my life is for the people in my community. And if they've asked me to be there to support them, I need to show up. So it's balancing those two, like my life is for the people and taking care of myself too. So yeah, good question. Other questions or comments? I'm just going to open it up.
I'll start with one, Debbie. This is Phyllis.
Sure.
I'm thinking about how we can, because one of the things that I've heard you talk about here and elsewhere is, is kind of taking our ancestors and all of that that's come before with us as we walk through our lives. And so I'm wondering how we pass that on, particularly within education and within higher education, to younger scholars who are coming in. So as I'm onboarding new scholars that come into our program or graduate students who I'm collaborating with and working with, how do I do some undoing so that I'm drawing on some of the teachings that you're sharing with us?
Yeah, good question. I think about, so what comes to mind for me is I teach a social welfare policy course, and also a social work foundations course, and we talk about different theories, and so for everybody, most people probably know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example. Well, it's great, but the Blackfeet nation actually came up with that before Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I think it's really important to make sure students are aware that all of these sort of packaged things that we use, theories from today, they've all been around for centuries, for many generations. We talk about environmental justice. Well, Native people have been talking about taking care of the earth since they've started walking it. We are part of the earth, right? So I think just trying to make those connections for yourself, right? Because then you can help students make those connections too. And remembering that most of the materials that are out came before. They just looked a little different and they were called something else. So we are sort of repackaging stuff that has been passed down from generation to generation. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Other thoughts or questions? I really want to just sort of open it up for conversation.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm Judy. You began with talking about how Native American children were taken away from their families, and I read something not very long about that, about the Canadians doing that. So were the Americans doing that as well?
Oh, yes, we did it first.
They did it first, yeah. I'm surprised that the Canadians would do that. That seems out of character, but when did that stop?
So trying to think, in the US, the boarding schools, there's still some boarding schools around. However, they're not, the mission is not the same. But the residential schools, the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996, not that long ago. And in the US, it wasn't too far before that. I think it was in the 70s or 80s. Yeah, I have people my age that I know that grew up in boarding schools.
So it was a sort of redoctrination to make them white, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Make
And
them-
what happened was that they would take in Canada, they called it the 60s scoop, but they would take children from their homes, place them in a boarding school when they got, and they were as young as 4, starting at the age of 4. For indigenous, many indigenous cultures, hair is a significant part of who we are, and it holds our thoughts, it holds our DNA, it holds our connection to Creator. And this is what children are, raised to understand. And so they would arrive at the boarding school, and boys, and the boys' hair would be cut off. They would be punished for speaking their native language. And of course, unfortunately, there were a lot of boarding school issues with physical and sexual child abuse. In Canada, and the thing that I really appreciate about Canada today is that they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They did a lot of hearings and have formulated some steps to reconcile and to make amends. And so one of the things that they've been doing is digging up the land around the residential schools to uncover the bodies of the children that were buried at those schools. And so far, I believe there's close to 5,000 bodies that have been found across Canada. The United States is just starting to do that at some of the schools, but that's with a lot of tribal push. It's not a United States government push. It's tribes really pushing that. The other important piece with that is a lot of these children died in the boarding schools from starvation, from disease, but their deaths were not reported to the families. So people were just left to wonder what happened to their child. And they weren't reported to the families primarily for funding, right? Because if they reported these children dead, then they would lose funding. Yeah, good question though. Good. And this is, yeah, sort of uncomfortable stuff, right? To hear about and to talk about, to learn. Yeah. Other questions or comments? So what inspired me really was finding learning more about my family roots and the importance of honoring that. So I think, thanks, Jamie, for your question. As a colonizer outside who wants to build a deeper relationship with the local land and develop greater understanding, respect for the people who came before me and those displaced, what is the best approach while being respectful? So I think acknowledging, right? That's a really big piece, is acknowledging, honoring who was here before us, and taking care of the land in a good way. Yeah. One thing that I like to share too, as people think about any other questions or comments, is that, well, two things came up that I wanted to speak about. The first is, Phyllis, I heard you talk about Indigenous Peoples Day being on Monday, and there's different thoughts about that from people who are Indigenous as well. And there's the great, we need to do away with Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. And then the other thought is, just do away with Columbus Day and give us our own day. We don't want to share a day with him. Well, we have forward movement happening, which is great. But then looking at, are we moving forward in the most respectful way, and finding out, well, what do other people think? What do people who are Indigenous think about that? The other thing that I think is really important to share is that, and I was talking about cultural appropriation earlier. There's a lot of, there's a lot of people who do different types of ceremony. Powwows are more of a social gathering, and typically, not always, but typically the public is welcome to attend. And that's a really great place to start and to learn, and to sort of be around that culture. Then if you're ever invited to a ceremony like a sweat lodge ceremony or a vision quest ceremony, it's really important to make sure that you are going somewhere that is doing that in a non-culturally appropriating way. And the biggest red flag that you could look for if you're ever invited to something is if people are charging you to attend, you need to run the other way. Native culture, they don't charge for ceremony. It's like telling someone they can't go to church unless they give you, unless you hand in $20 or $50 or $500 before you walk in the door. Yes, you tithe and they ask for contributions, but I don't know of any that tell you you can't walk through the door and pray. Yeah, so that's something I think that's really important to pay attention to. Other questions or comments? I can find other stuff to talk about, but we just have a couple minutes left, so.
A question.
Mhm.
So with I'll say Turkey Day coming up next month, how do we kind of acknowledge and honor the Native experience while sort of having to be social pressured into attending dinners and things with family?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the big piece is acknowledging that, right? So one of the things, and my husband and I will go to friends for Turkey Day or the day of giving thanks. We try not to say Thanksgiving. We use other words. And sort of look at that as it's also a time to get together with family and friends and share in this meal, right, and give thanks. But I think making an acknowledgement, a lot of times families will say a prayer before they eat, or people will say something that they're thankful for. I think taking the time to acknowledge that, that this holiday is from the deaths of many Indigenous peoples, and and doing that is important. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. So really simple things, right, that you can do. It doesn't have to be big. And yeah, so is history and legend passed down primarily through spoken word and storytelling? Yeah, so Native culture is an oral, really steeped in oral tradition, passing down stories of how the tribe was, people were created. Um, my husband is a native storyteller, and I love, he's got lots of animal stories about how the bear came to be, how the bear lost its tail, because the bear used to have a big fluffy tail, and it got cut off because of a fox. So lots of really great stories, and yeah. And my husband has been asked to do some storytelling via Zoom through, through the time of COVID, and he can't do it. He's like, nope, it's got to be in person, got to be face to face. Can't do it. Technology. So that's just him. Yeah.
Anyone else? Any more questions?
So I want to thank you, everybody, for being here. And certainly if you have any other questions or anything that sparked your interest that you want to reach out to me about, please feel free to do that. And thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for having me here, and Judy for coordinating all of this and inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to share in this way, and not have an hour lecture, just an hour of sharing.
That was very nice. And thanks to everybody for going through the registration process and attending this meeting today. It was really nice, the presentation. So thanks to everyone.